This is Progress Canada. Canada's new government is about to deliver its first throne speech, and this time King Charles will read it. Lloyd Rang, president and narrative lead of Curious Public Content and Insights, joins me to explain what goes into writing a throne speech, how it turns campaign promises into policy, and what to listen for as the Carney era begins. Thanks for joining me, Lloyd.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So today we're going to talk about the throne speech. So we're going to be releasing this episode the weekend ahead of it actually taking place. So hopefully we'll give folks a good primer on what the heck a throne speech is, what to look for, and what it's going to tell us about the new government that's been formed. So you are a speechwriter. You have been for a long time. You've written for a lot of impressive people. You've also had the opportunity in the past to write a throne speech yourself. And again, the throne speech is sort of like a mission statement of a sitting government, so it can lay out its priorities. Can you tell our audience what exactly a throne speech is and what makes it distinct, in tone, purpose, and audience from other political speeches?
Yeah, thanks for that, Teresa. Well, I wrote throne speeches for the province of Ontario, going back all the way to the Mike Harris government, actually, when I was on the civil service side, through to the
I always forget about that.
Yeah. Through to the
there.
end of the 50 years. So I've written a few of these bad boys over the years. It's really interesting because it's typically read by the Crown's representative, sort of lieutenant governor at the provincial level and the governor general at the federal level. And so it's the government's agenda written from the point of view of the Crown, which lends itself to all kinds of interesting language. So the first thing that stands out in a throne speech is that it's not we will, but it is your government will, and it's not even will, it's would, right? Your government would or will, if passed, do X, Y, and Z. Because the other thing that a throne speech can't do is it can't presume that legislation will pass.
Right.
That's contempt of the legislature, so it has to be written in a very conditional sort of way. So There's just structurally, for the nerds who like language like me, it's really interesting from just sort of a linguistic and syntactical point of view, because it's written in a very prescribed style. So that's kind of fun. It's an interesting, when you're writing as you're working on a speech like that as a writer, you're sort of it's like writing a sonnet. You're sort of bound by the convention, right? So you have to write kind of within it, which is really interesting. And then it varies from sort of government to government and from province to the feds, but typically there's kind of a retrospective aspect to it, like in the previous year, the following parliamentarians have passed away. That's something that throne speeches sometimes do. They recollect the last time the legislature got together. They kind of do a little bit of a backwards looking thing before moving into the sort of forward looking agenda. And so in laying out the agenda, the first throne speech of a new government is typically modeled on the platform. So the platform initiatives from the campaign will be repurposed in the throne speech in a way that maybe fleshes them out a little bit more. And since you can't implement the entire platform agenda and you certainly can't describe it in a throne speech, it'd be 17 hours long if you did. It sort of picks and chooses from sort of highlights of the platform that in the legislative session the government hopes to pass. So why that's important is it gives people a sense of what the immediate priorities of the government are going to be, what are the first things that they're going to do from the things that they said they would do, and that gives people a sense of what the agenda in Ottawa is going to be for the coming year or more.
So I want to dive into that a little bit, because in this last election, one of the parties, the one that did not form government, had, an 100-day agenda for, the first 100 days in office. And this is really taking from the U.S. tradition of, I think it goes back to Roosevelt. You may know more than me because you're also a nerd, but
Yes,
I think it's the 1930s and Roosevelt, and the idea that they had such an ambitious agenda in, I think it was 1932, that all presidencies after that were defined by the first 100 days in office and how much they got done, and it really set the tone. Another way that throne speeches are similar to the US system, and I do find Canadians tend to understand the US system better than the Canadian system sometimes, is that this is sort of like, that inaugural address when the president first gets introduced to the people after an election. Now, throne speeches happen more often, as you pointed out, because they are based on the parliamentary session. Anytime there is a new session, there's a new throne speech. And governments sometimes set a new session to be able to give a throne speech to reset their political agenda.
Yep.
But a lot of it is very, very similar to that. So can you talk about, being the nerd that you are, some of the differences from the political system of the US to Canada in this type of like big showy speech from the leadership?
Well, that's a big question, Teresa. So what's interesting about that is that it goes to kind of the heart of the difference between the Westminster parliamentary system and sort of Republican government, which is like, or a government republic. Where in the US, I think the executive can set more of the legislative agenda and can reasonably expect, especially with strong majorities, can reasonably expect to get legislation passed. They are much more capable of doing things within that 100-day window than Canadian governments would be, because you can't, especially in a minority government like we're in now. Obviously there's a bit of horse trading and it has to be carefully negotiated. So for a government to say, as Mr. Poilievre wanted to say, that they will achieve X, Y, and Z, and I say Z deliberately, by 100 days is kind of kooky, right? You can't possibly predict what you'll be able to pass in 100 days. In 100 days in the legislature in the Canadian system, it's not doable. So that's a nice bit of rhetoric,
Right.
but it doesn't hold up to the scrutiny of reality, frankly. So nor would it be like, it's weird, right? Because I remember I've written speeches for conservative governments, right? And the Harris government and the Eves government, for example, were very circumspect around protecting the integrity of the legislature. I mean, we can disagree politically, but they had a great deal of respect for the traditions of the House. So I think it's an interesting thing that, in the intervening, 25 years or so, conservatives, it's another mark of how conservatism in Canada has changed, because I can't imagine, a Guy Giorno or any of those other sort of, old like Tory staffers ever signing on to a 100-day agenda. Like, it just wouldn't. I think that would be anathema to them. So I think it's interesting. That's interesting. The funny thing is, though, like there's sort of a media thing that happens after 100 days, though, in Canada, where like the media uses that 100-day window to assess how the government is done. So they've adopted that from the US, and they use that as kind of like a report card. But I think that's more of a function of story creation than it is of like anything else. So interesting, but I think again, especially in a minority government, things move in unpredictable ways. So we'll see what comes to pass. The other thing is, I mean, to pass, I don't know if and when a government has ever fallen on a throne speech, but I mean, technically they could, right? Like a throne speech is a confidence measure. So right from the beginning, you have to line up your support for your agenda among the other parties. So one of the other things that's going to be happening is the throne speech will be informed by those conversations that they're having behind closed doors with people to say, what can you get behind? What can you support? What can we, and whoever the parties are, what can you support, in our agenda for, the first session?
So I want to touch on something in that, which is, the 100 days messaging, to your point, is a message technique. It isn't actually a thing in our parliamentary system. And that really speaks to the difference between campaign writing and then government writing, of which you've done a lot of both. So can you tell folks how speechwriters translate these campaign promises and the language that's used during campaigns into, the more formal institutional language of a throne speech?
Funny story about that. So I wrote the throne speech for Ernie Eves, the one and only throne speech for Ernie Eves.
Right.
And I was surprised to find the throne speech comprised a good chunk of the platform that year.
Right.
Literally, the language from the throne speech itself was ported over into the platform document. So in that case, the throne speech, it was the other way around, right? The throne speech kind of helped build the platform, right? And then had they won, the throne speech would have reflected back on the platform, like you said. Typically, new government comes in, new energy, new people. All the people who are on the campaign are going to be the ones writing, all the big moments, informing all the big policies, doing all the work with, working with the other parties. Like, there's fresh energy that comes in. So, I would assume that the same would be true here. I think the very interesting thing to watch out for is to see if the I'm not a policy nerd, but I'll play one for a moment. It'll be interesting to see if any of the policy from the platform has changed in any sort of substantial way as a consequence of speaking to the other parties and looking for support, or if this kind of external situation has changed such that there are needed changes to particular policy pieces, right? So one thing to watch, for example, is Canadian American relations language. In the election or in the campaign, that tone was pretty strident, I would say, right? It was pretty stridently pro-Canada, and definitely, Trump and tariffs were kind of a major theme in the Liberal campaign. It'd be interesting to see what form that takes now that the president and the prime minister have sat down. Is there, will there be a tonal shift there? I have some thoughts on that. Potentially, it'd be interesting, but I think the context of the king giving the speech suggests something interesting. So we'll get to that in a bit, but I think it'll be interesting from a policy standpoint to see what's changed.
So on that, yes, the king is going to be reading out the speech. So this is something that's, this is the third time in our history as a country that this will be taking place. The last two times were by Queen Elizabeth, the king's mother. Usually the monarch does not go over to various nations in the Commonwealth and read out a throne speech. So this is something really special, and this is something that was at the request of the prime minister. So you were just talking about the U.S. relationship. That obviously is playing a big role in the fact that the king is actually coming here to deliver this speech. It's a whirlwind tour. Like, it's not usually when a monarch comes, they come for 5 to 7 days. They go across various points of the country. You've seen that up close yourself. This time it's very much an in and out 2-day thing. He's coming to open Parliament. He's going to read the speech and then he's going to get out. But it is very much a symbolic thing that he's coming to do this. So, what are some of the behind the scenes considerations or constraints that influence how the priorities are framed in the throne speech because the monarch is the one delivering it?
Oh, see, there's another. This is a long conversation. I think it's interesting. So, I'm looking back. I'm just doing a quick bit of, because I'm checking my memory for a second here on the date. But okay, so the monarchy is traditionally very circumspect and subtle in its support for Canadian sovereignty, or sovereignty of any nation in the empire, right, or in the Commonwealth, right? 1991, when Charles and Diana visited Canada, Charles gave a speech on at Grant Hall at the University, or Queen's University in Kingston, that I was at, and This is around the time of the unity crisis.
Right.
There's a lot of tension in Canada at the time, and the King gave a masterful, I think, speech on the importance of Canada, the importance of national unity, but he did so in such a way that was, again, appropriate to the crown. Like, he didn't wade into politics, but he spoke about, he spoke in very symbolic terms. He spoke in very, like, sort of high level terms about what Canada means to the world, which I thought it's a wonderful speech. And if I were writing the throne speech this time around, I would probably check that speech to see if there was any notes that I could lift from it, because I think it was wonderful, but it speaks to the way that the crown has to operate politically, which is, sort of at arm's length from the issues of the day, although obviously the issues of the day affect the crown. So during all of this sort of Trumpy, tariffy time that we're in, the king has actually symbolically and subtly expressed his support for Canada by planting a Canadian maple on the palace grounds, by wearing Canadian naval insignia, like little things like that for royal watchers. That's a big deal, right? He's making a statement without making a statement. So it'd be really interesting to hear what the language is from the crown in this moment of kind of tension between Canada and its largest trading partner and its oldest ally, to see how that subtlety plays out in the language. I'm going to be fascinated to see what the king has to say in that speech. So it'll be really, really interesting. I think it will be largely laudatory of Canada and its historic role and its historic place, and probably also speak to the need for ongoing national unity, especially at a time of crisis. Like, I think those are appropriate, themes. But we'll see.
Another element of this is because when people think about the throne speech, there's many audiences. There's, Canadians, there are international partners, et cetera, et cetera. Part of having the king come too is not just a sovereignty play. It's also we've got the king on speed dial play to Trump. And, so Carney's first meeting with Trump in the Oval Office, when Trump brought up the 51st state stuff again, Carney pushed back saying, it's not for sale. Some real estate is never for sale. And he pointed out this White House that we're sitting in. And then he said, but also Buckingham Palace, which I know you're a fan of, because Trump he's a royal watcher. Like he's obsessed with celebrity, of course. And to him, the greatest celebrity thing you could be is a king. And there's a bit of this in the American psychology anyway. Like, they got rid of their king, but they kind of really love monarchy. And they treat their presidents in a similar fashion. So, having the king deliver this speech as well is a nod also to the relationship with the U.S., not just from a sovereignty front, but also from hey, this guy stands with us, so maybe you should chill out front. I'm wondering if you can talk about what to expect from the Canada-U.S. lens in this speech, because I think it will be obviously an enormous part of this first throne speech of this government. But what are you sort of expecting from it? And you were just talking about just before about how some of the language from the campaign is already pivoting and what that might look like in this speech.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I'm reminded of something else as you're talking. I'm reminded of The Simpsons, of all things, Sideshow Bob. So Sideshow Bob says in one episode, you need me, Springfield. Your guilty conscience may force you to vote Democratic, but deep down inside, you secretly long for a cold-hearted Republican to lower taxes, brutalize criminals, and rule you like a king. That's why I did this, to protect you from yourself. Like, deep in the American psyche, and like Simpsons always tells the truth. There is this kind of ongoing nostalgia for monarchy in a way that we Canadians don't have, because we have one. We don't have to be nostalgic for it. And Trump, right down to the gilded leaf in the old Oval Office, is trying to establish that.
So, not to interrupt you, but I was trying to rack my brain of has it always been like that? I know his home in New York is like that, and I'm sure Mar-a-Lago is like that, but I don't remember the gilded leaf in previous administrations. Is that a Trump aesthetic.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think Trump more than anyone worships power, pomp, circumstance. He's having a military parade, for God's sakes, for his birthday. So,
Right.
like there's obviously an authoritarian kind of loving streak in the man. So, and kings are representative of that. But it's sort of a a a child's understanding of what a modern monarchy is, right? Like, because the role again is much more subtle and than Trump probably knows or understands. So I think to go back to the point, I think it's the symbolism of that is significant in Canadian American relations, having the monarch read the speech from the throne, because it does a number of things. First of all, it establishes a history to Canada that's different than the United States. So Trump likes to say, there's this big, long, imaginary line, looks like it was drawn by a ruler, dismissing Canadian history and identity with a wave of his hand. The reality is, of course, Canada is all the parts of North America that didn't want to be American, and a good chunk of is British heritage, right? So the interesting thing about that is that it once again reminds Americans that Canadians are different. We have a different history, we have a different culture, we have a different sort of frame of reference. We see the world differently, and they're sometimes reminded of that when somebody like Melanie Jolie pops up, or when the Prime Minister starts speaking French. But that British heritage, I think, is what is being emphasized in this case, right, with Parliament. So there's that. The second thing is, it's sort of like after a breakup, you go and hang out with your friend, like your friends, and maybe you date some new people, and it's a little bit of like, hey, look, like, yeah, we had a good thing going at one time, but as the Prime Minister said, the old relationship is over, and you will recall we have other friends over here, right. Some of them with older and deeper and hotter traditions than yours, Mr. President. Right. So, but there's substantive thing to that too, which is like the latest trade data from Canada and the U.S. is that, well, cross-border trade between Canada and the U.S. has dropped 6%. It's Canada's increased its net exports to other markets by 25%. So there's an interesting thing that's happened here, which is it's not just a symbolic redirection of relationships, but actually a practical, real, tangible redirection of relationships. And so it's no accident that when Carney became the Prime Minister, his first official act was to fly to Europe and go talk to some old friends, right? And this is a continuation of that. So I would expect, based again on that part of the content of the speech or the tone of the speech will be Canada in a new world in which we are looking to other trading partners, we are looking to other markets, we are looking to cement our reputation internationally. We are looking, and not just trading partners, defense partners. I would not be surprised if the speech has a fairly strong defense component to it as well, because it was something that both parties agreed on, that Canada's been spending far too little on national defense over the last little while. It's funny because it's exactly what Trump said we should do, and we're doing it, but not for the reasons that he said we should. But so I think that'll be interesting. And of course, and the other thing is too, of course, that Canadian soldiers swear their oath to the crown, right? So everybody in the armed forces, swears allegiance to the crown. The tradition of the crown and the armed forces is, of course, like very, very powerful, very strong. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the speech as well, and how and again in the ceremony and the pomp around the monarch's visit will be interesting too.
It is interesting because you mentioned the oath, and of course, politicians in this country also swear their oath to the monarch.
Yeah.
And even just thinking of, in the US, you have the president who's also the commander in chief. That's not the case in Canada. We have our governor general doing that on behalf of the king, of course. So that just adds, a further layer to the difference there. So I do think that is interesting, and I wonder what that section of the speech will look like because of that fact. Before we go on to the next question, I did want to add, that's the federal to federal relationship, but there are, you've probably seen recently, a number of U.S. governors who have been pleading with Canada to still come visit. We had, Governor Pritzker in Illinois recently making his pitch. We had Gavin Newsom in California making his pitch. The governor of Colorado has been like waving the Canadian flag repeatedly over the last few months. Like they had a day where I think it was like a Canadian Friendship Day or something. Like they're very obsessed with keeping the relationship alive, even if it's a bit rocky between, the heads of government. Do you think there's going to be any bones thrown to those folks in this, or is it strictly like we're just dealing with Trump and, we'll let the chips lay where they might?
Oh, my take on this from reading social media particularly is that, when the 51st state rhetoric first started up, Canadians took a very hard line very quickly on blue states, which is to say, we don't care. At this point, we don't care. You're all Americans. We don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear that you like us. We don't want to hear that you care about us. We don't want to hear your bleeding heart appeals to our to tourists in Canada to come visit you, because an American is an American is an American right now, and we're all Canadian, and we're going to boycott you. I think that may have softened just a scooch, but not much. Like I think it's still very much elbows up, and it takes almost nothing for that sentiment to come roaring right back again online. It just takes one or two words from the president or JD Vance, and we're back to square one again. So I don't think that there will be a lot of exception carved out for blue states at this point. Particularly, again, the federal government's doesn't negotiate with states and doesn't deal much. It deals peer to peer. So national government to national government. The subnational governments are going to do what they're going to do, right? Alberta has decided to take its own kind of Alberta path on this whole thing. But for the most part, I think I think Canadian leadership is pretty squarely focused on solving a Canadian problem, which is what do we do about what do we do about trade? What do we do about what do we do about our relationships? What do we do about our exports? And a lot of that stuff is falling on deaf ears right now. Interestingly, in my own practice, in Curious Public, we're fielding a lot more calls from American companies now that are saying, so how do we do business in Canada right now? Exactly.
And they're like, well,
I was like, oh, that's an interesting question. Let me think about that for, a large retainer. No, but I
was going to say, well, on retainer, yeah.
But no, but it is they are, Americans trying to do business in Canada, or trying to lure Canadian investment or lure Canadian tourists or whatever, are finding it very difficult right now because they are surprised with the strength of the backlash. But it goes back to there's a fundamental misunderstanding. I'll get on a soapbox for a second, but I think Americans have a fundamental misunderstanding about what Canadians are all about. They think we're nice. We're not nice. We're kind.
Well, it's so funny you say that, and I make that distinction all the time between nice and kind, because they're not the same thing. Nice is about politeness. Kindness is about doing the right thing and giving people hard truths when you need to. And it's so funny because the governor of Illinois, his message was very much talking about how the Illinois nice is like pretty similar to the Canadian vibe. He's like, just come across the lake to Chicago and da da da. And he was like really trying to appeal on a vibes lens. And we're like, no, like you don't get how mad we are at you right now as a nation. As much as we may like Pritzker as a guy who's pretty progressive himself and has been standing up against Trump quite a bit, at the end of the day, to your point, we are pretty united on this front.
Well, Canadians, here's the thing, like Canadians are principled people by and large, right? So
Right.
you can't have a national healthcare system without having values and principles to support it. Like you can't make that kind of sacrifice as a population without, right? So a lot of the big things that we've done as a country have arisen from the values that we have as people. So we, jumped to the United States' defense, and in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We declared war on Japan before the Americans even did. Like we, we created a national railway out of Bear Rock and everything else because there are things that we believe in that we're willing to sacrifice for. And it's not just words, it's not just rhetoric, it's deeply rooted in values and principles. We don't like bullies, right? We don't like it when people pick on other people, and we're willing to stand up for that. And so Americans are always surprised that the kindness that Canadians show is also directed at themselves. Like Canadians are also kind to themselves and strong and strongly patriotic and strong about our feelings about our country as well. And when we're under threat, like, hockey's a really great metaphor, right? When Canada plays anybody, doesn't matter where you're from in the country, you're cheering for Team Canada, and you're doing so passionately, and everybody's glued to the set, and that's always been the case. So I think that misunderstanding, and Canadian, like American businesses have failed repeatedly in Canada because they've misunderstood the Canadian kindness thing. In profound ways. Like Target came into Canada and thought they could just import an American model completely. They had supply chain issues and other stuff, but like they thought they could just kind of barge into the Canadian market with a great brand that people were just going to lap up, and didn't happen. Sidewalk Labs came into Toronto, at the behest of Google, to build this, dream development on the waterfront. It fell apart because people in New York thought, well, Toronto's just like New York, but nicer. Well, no, there's like deep passive aggression in Canadian business. There's like all kinds of stuff going on here that, like, superficially it may seem similar, but we're very, very different. And again, going back to the throne speech, I think this is an opportunity to lay out what some of those differences are. One of the things the Prime Minister, he's got a book called Values, for Pete's sakes. Like, one of the things the Prime Minister's really has spoken to in very powerful ways is what values are, and how values play themselves out in the actions of a government or in leadership, right? So if you start from a place of values and you're starting to, and you approach government that way, what are the decisions that you're going to make that, that bake values into your outcomes? So it's really interesting. So I think you will doubtless hear the word value or values in the speech somewhere. And that's a throwback, I think, to the Prime Minister's own point of view, which is that Canadians have unique values, a unique value set, and we will work together to understand and work out what that means together.
I do think it's kind of interesting because, when I think about US culture, so much of it is actually shaped by Canadians. So you have things like SNL. And so when Mike Myers was on there recently doing all his stuff, people were like, in the US were like, oh, what's happening? Because of course they don't get the same news that we do about what's going on in Canada. And I think about, like the Celine Dion's of the world, the Shania Twains, the Justin Biebers, like those were huge people in American culture. And, we're talking about movie tariffs recently with Trump, and, Hollywood North and Toronto and Vancouver is such a huge thing, Winnipeg even. But then I think about when the Tragically Hip performed their last concert. And I don't know if you remember the Twitter posts at the time, but people were saying, like, sorry, America, we're closed for the night. We're having a wake. And like the Tragically Hip is one of those bands that really shows the difference, because they didn't break through in the US, but they are beloved in this country. And it really just shows like there is something different going on there. There's a secret sauce about Canada that America just does not understand. It'll be interesting to see if any of that is in this speech.
Again, I feel like a quote machine here, but so Martin Short had a great quote, and it was in TV Guide like a million years ago, and I've looked for it online. I can't find it anywhere, but I swear to God I read it. And he was interviewed, and he said, somebody asked him, why are so many comedians from Canada? And he said, well, what you need to understand is Americans watch television and Canadians watch American television. And that sense of distance gives us a perspective that you don't have on yourselves, which is why we're so able to be funny about ourselves, but also about you. Another person described, Canada and the US as like a one-way mirror, right? We're watching them. They're not observing us at all. They don't know anything about us, but we see everything that they do. Like we know, I would hazard to guess that Canadians know way more about American geography, way more about American culture, way more about American government than Americans probably know about themselves in some cases, but certainly way more than Americans know about Canadians. And that Rick Mercer had a whole bit about that. So I think, Canada is in a unique outsider position in culture to produce really great cultural artistic talent, which we've done, that provides a lens to the United States to see itself differently. But we also produce homegrown talent that mean a lot to us. It's not just the Tragically Hip. It's like, Rush has kind of a cult following in the States, but like Rush is way more important in Canada than it, ever was in the US.
Right.
And on it goes, right? And drilling down Quebec
the
culture,
example,
too, right?
I was going to say that the example I would give is there's actually a YouTube account right now that has gotten a lot of play during this whole dispute with the US. And it's an American who's learning about Canadian culture and history by just like researching things, and then he posts his reactions to stuff. And probably the most powerful episode was when he was watching this mini documentary about Terry Fox.
Yeah.
And he was like, I have no idea who Terry Fox is. And then he's listening, he's like the greatest person of all time. It's like essentially like also the greatest Canadian, but like the amount of money the run has made, the fact that, in his death, he's been able to cure the cancer that he had, all these things. And this is something that just like most Americans do not know about at all, but like probably the biggest Canadian cultural icon and sports icon of, people talk about Wayne Gretzky and stuff like that, but Terry Fox is the greatest athlete this country has ever produced, right?
Yeah. The great once, I like to call him. Yeah. So no, and that's absolutely true. And that's, again, though, what's the story of Terry Fox, right? Like sacrifice, self-sacrifice, incredible odds, perseverance, right? Like the Canadian wilderness and the landscape in that story. Like there's so much going on in that story that is, but it's about kindness, right? Yep. And it's about Canadians coming together and compassion. And even though he fell short of his goal, that's not the point of the story. It is like the differences are legion, and they're deep. They're so deep, and they're so poorly understood south of the border. And I think there's a fierceness to Canadians as a consequence of that is sort of taking them by surprise. I thought Carney did a fantastic job speaking to the president and holding his ground in the most Canadian, polite, but also firm way possible. I think it's I don't know. I think first of all, I think we're in really great hands right now, in both domestically and internationally. I will be interested to see how the Prime Minister transitions from campaign to government, and whether or not he runs into any roadblocks or any hindrances in terms of like implementing his agenda, given that parts of it are very aggressive. So I don't know how quickly the Canadian political, the Canadian government apparatus is going to shift to meet those high expectations.
Yeah, government is not something that turns on a dime typically. So it'll be interesting to see. And given it being a minority parliament, even though they have a very strong caucus in that minority parliament, that means you don't necessarily have the same runway that you would normally have. You do not have 4 years guaranteed to you. No. What do you think? What should Canadians watch for in terms of language, structure, and symbolism in the throne speech? So obviously, we've discussed already that these are very symbolic speeches. They like to lay on some flowery language. Sometimes it's not like boring bureaucratic language, but it's also not campaign rhetoric. So what kind of stuff should people be looking for in this speech?
Well, I mean, Canada is a big tent of regional interests and strong regional interests, and Quebec will be looking for Quebec things, as Quebec always does. But I think increasingly the question is, how do you bring Westerners, particularly Albertans, who feel alienated from, I'm doing air quotes, feeling alienated from Canada, sorry, to the West, but feeling alienated, because like the reality is, back up for a bit, like Quebec knows how to play the game, right? So Quebec makes demands of the federal government, and then based on who's in power and everything else, they vote accordingly. Like at times they've supported conservatives, at times they've supported liberals, at times they've gone out on their own and voted very strongly for the bloc. But Quebec always acts in Quebec's best interests, but they shift their allegiances politically based on what they think will get them the best deal for Quebec. Whereas Alberta, due respect, adamantly going to vote conservative. You could paint a fire hydrant blue and it'll get elected in Alberta. So, and they have. So what incentive does a government have to address those, particularly when the province hasn't really voted for the government much? I mean, there are some Alberta Liberal MPs, but you know what I mean? So what'll be interesting to see is how far this government will go, given that the Prime Minister is from Edmonton, given that he has said repeatedly he wants to be the Prime Minister for everyone. He wants to bring everybody along. He wants to unify the country. He wants people to see themselves reflected in their government, no matter where they're from or who they voted for. What does that look like in the throne speech, and what does that look like governing going forward? That's a really interesting question, because frankly, the Prime Minister is under no obligation to do anything for Alberta because they don't vote for Liberal governments. They don't. So he's under no, like, he doesn't owe them anything, except, I think, from his own personal values and from his own background and from his own ethics. I think he feels as though he wants to bring them aboard. So what does that look like? Be interesting to see.
So, we've talked about regionality, and a lot of folks who have been talking about what might be in the speech are focused on, resources and building infrastructure across the country to move those resources, et cetera, and maybe that will play to the Alberta crowd, et cetera. Quebec is largely believed to mostly have handed this government to Carney. They were the ones that generally switched their votes and went over to him in droves after the Liberal Party underperformed a bit in Ontario. BC, I think this was the best result the Liberals have ever had in BC, so that's a big component of it as well.
Yep.
And, with the exception of Saskatchewan and Alberta, most of the premiers are actually very willing to work with this Prime Minister and showed that on the trail as well. So there's all of that. The thing that I want to touch on a little bit here is, how can this throne speech pivot what the government has been doing for the last decade in terms of actually supporting young people? So you and I have worked with organizations like Generation Squeeze before, and there has been a big shift. You now have millennials who, I'm one, we're not that young anymore, but we are the largest voting bloc in the country now. So, but, there's that group, and now there's Gen Z coming in, which is increasingly conservative, especially when you talk about young men. What would you be looking for in this speech to reach out to those groups of people? Because, of course, they aren't just regionally based. Those folks exist everywhere in the country.
That's a big question. So, I mean, I think I have a theory on why older folks skewed liberal this time. And older, the older you were and the more educated you were, the more likely you were to vote liberal. That's just a demographic fact. And women largely voted for liberals this time around as well. And so the group that voted for the conservatives this time around were working age males, right, of a particular background, and then young men who, again, tended to vote conservative and did so in the States as well. It's a reflective of the GOP success as well. And so they pulled a lot of new voters this time from those two groups. but I think for very different reasons, right? I think older men, like working age men, I think particularly, like tradespeople, blue collar folks, they see their influence and their power diminishing, right? As the country moves in a particular direction, and the things that they take for granted are not being given to them anymore. It's not as easy as it was. I think the younger crowd, the Gen Zs, have a almost a stronger case. Like, so I'm Gen X. I got into the housing market when, you could still get into the housing market on my salary. If I were starting out today, I wouldn't be buying a house. There's no way. So
I'm going to die in my apartment.
yeah, no, 100%. I mean, not you, but 100% that's
I
true.
will, but yeah.
Yeah. But like, so, I mean, that's, well, that took a grim turn, didn't it? So no, but like, I think, so they like Gen Z, and the Prime Minister even said this, like Prime Minister's Gen X as well. I just turned 60. And he said, when I was young, there was a deal. You go to school, you work hard, you buy a house, you have a family, and that's your life, and it's guaranteed. And Gen Z sees no such guarantee, right? None. And because
I would
affordability is
say the difference is like men my age, millennial men, were given a certain promise that they would inherit the same type of life as their fathers, and it hasn't worked that out that way. But men who are Gen Z were never even given that promise in the first
that's
place.
true
They just
too.
were told, "Good luck. It's
Yeah,
awful for you."
true. True. Yeah, and and they grew up during COVID, and they've had a lot of miserable experiences. In
Yeah,
fairness, right? So my son's Gen Z. He's just entering fourth year of university. I'm thinking, oh, he's going to be living. He's going to be living at home for a while, probably once he gets out. So,
right.
and that's just the reality, right? And we actually see that we see that in homes in subdivisions all over the 905 that were designed to be starter homes. They've now got 4 or 5 cars in the driveway because Gen Zs are living at home, commuting from their homes, like, right? And it's interesting. And it's terrifying because it means that there's no upward mobility for them. And the reality is that real estate is most people's retirement plan to a large degree as well. And so not only are they not able to enter the market, they don't have the security of a long-term asset to leverage against their retirement for later on too. So like if you forecast this out further, they're going to be working longer, right? Like that's a grim thing. But there are so many variables that affect that. There's so many drivers of that. Like it's not just housing affordability. And housing affordability in and of itself has about 17 different things that drive it. But it's inflation, it's wage stagnation, it's changes in the labor market, it's AI, it's a ton of things that are hitting people all upside the head, all at the same time. Anybody that tells you that that's a problem easily solved is selling you something. Like, I think the simplicity of the conservative message around this, right, which is we're just going to cut taxes, we're just going to do this, we're just going to a couple of quick fixes, and Bob's your uncle, everything will be great again. No. It's not going to be like that. It's not going to be like that. So this generation of young people has got an uphill climb,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to take concerted effort from everyone in every sector of the economy, government, private sector, everyone working together to try to restore that, if that is at all what we're trying to do. My worry is looking at the United States is that that's actually not the goal. Like
Right.
that the government of the United States is actually quite happy to eliminate the middle class and the middle class dream.
I think you're right on that. Like, obviously, they're being governed by a billionaire class in that country. It does bring up something that I think hasn't been talked enough about with this throne speeches, which I think will be, a bulk of it, is the focus on growth and like an economy that isn't just about what we're already doing and thinking long term. I think the one criticism of the Trudeau government, I thought he was great on social policy, but the one criticism that Conservatives had, that he had no plan for the economy, is probably true, because we didn't really talk about it. Having said that, Poilievre had no plan for the economy either. And Carney's the first politician in a while at the national stage who's actually talking about how do we grow the economy? How do we make sure we have, a strong Canadian economy for future generations, and actually thinking about that long-term push. So I suspect there will be some elements in the speech around that topic.
Yeah, like I've, met the Prime Minister a couple of times, had some long conversations with him, read the book cover to cover.
Right.
The thing about the Prime Minister is that he doesn't think like a typical Liberal. Typical Liberal's solution to a problem is to dump money at it in one segment, right? So if you've got a productivity problem, the solution is obviously education. So we're just going to dump a pile of money into education, that'll fix the productivity problem, right? No, it actually doesn't work that way, because what this PM is different in many ways. He's different in many ways, but one of the main differences, I think, is if you hear him talk about the value chain, he talks about reverse integration. So the housing plan is not just, we're going to dump billions of dollars into the housing industry and we're going to build more houses. It's like, no, it actually starts with forestry. It starts like way at the end of the chain, right? Yep. And we're going to use Canadian lumber, right? Yep. And we're going to invest in education. We're going to invest in training. We're going to invest in apprenticeships. We're going to invest in modular home design and building. We're going to invest in that technology, and we're going to work with the municipalities in the province to free up public lands to build homes on, and so that, like, he's looking at the entire continuum of an industry from front to back, and looking at the ways that the federal government can intervene as an investor in that value chain to create an outcome. And that's different. And that no Prime Minister has done before.
That, and during the campaign, we had the wrap up, which was our election show, and we kept talking about how refreshing it was to have a Liberal campaign, or any campaign, constantly tying things back into each other that was announced. Like, this almost never happens, but he came up with his, like, here's our plan to deal with the US, and that means we're going to have a strong economy, so we're going to build a bunch of houses, we're going to use BC lumber. Like, yep. Every time, everything tied back to each other. So, if nothing else, I hope that's what's happening in the speech, is that it actually makes coherent sense across the board, because it's been thoughtfully constructed.
Yeah, I think you'll see that. And I think you'll see that I would, values, unity, purpose, right? Coming together, more of an east-west alignment of the country as opposed to a north-south alignment of the country. Like, you touched on it earlier. You talked about pipelines and infrastructure. Like, those are not just symbolic things. When you, like, creating an east-west, flow of trade and goods and raw materials is not just there's a material component to that, which is like American crude or Canadian crude gets refined in the US, and the pipelines go north-south because that's where the refineries are. Frankly, if Alberta had accepted the national energy policy, they would have refineries of their own. Whole other story. But right, so to get those to get that crude out to where it can be refined, that's not the United States, you do need east-west means of transportation, right? Similarly, electricity, like Ontario and Quebec both export electricity and energy to the US, right? BC is a net importer, I believe, right? So how do you re-articulate the transmission grid to run east-west so that surplus energy from one part of the country can be transferred to the other part of the country? Like, these are not trivial things, or like there's an important self-sufficiency thing happening here, but also a realign, like, that supports the realignment of trade and globally, that I think is really important for us to keep in mind as well. So there's like, to your point, Teresa, there's like just the granular level of thinking that's gone into some of this stuff is really refreshing, because the prime minister keeps asking questions like, well, what about this? What about and he keeps following the chain further and further back till like, and he's making connections all along the way. And that's what a good economist does.
So just as we wrap up here, you've been a communications professional and a speechwriter for quite a while now. What advice do you have for people who sort of want to break into this kind of work? What should they learn from listening to the throne speech? How should they, look at these kind of moments in terms of figuring out what they want to do in this space?
It's a great thing to do. It's watching speeches, listening to speeches, absorbing best practice from like watching the really, good speech givers give their speeches. I think is like really great, is really great practice. And the thing that you need to appreciate about the job is that it is not, you're not going to be some genius toiling away by yourself and coming up with the thing that you give to the person and they just read it verbatim because it's, oh my God, it's so brilliant. It takes everybody. Like the other thing that a speechwriter does is coordinate among, first of all, everybody else in an organization or in a party to be able to pull all the ideas together, and then also work with the person who's giving the speech to make it their own. It's not an exercise in just one person's creativity. It is a team sport, absolutely. So getting over yourself and recognizing that you just have you have a role to play in coordination and framing and narrative development, and it may be turning a cute phrase or two, but really it belongs to everyone. But it mostly belongs to the person who gives the speech, and they have a tremendous. The best thing that you can hope for, and the coolest part of the job, is developing a really great rapport with the person who is the leader, because then you learn to anticipate what they're going to say. You learn to anticipate how they think. You embody their voice, and you're able to create something that's for them. And so the line, it's funny because Ted Sorensen was asked who came up with the line. Ask not what your country can do for you, or ask not what you can. How's that go again?
Do for your country, ask
for your country, ask what your, yeah. So and he said, I don't know, because I don't remember how it came about. All I know is that it was the president's line. The president said it, so it's his. Right.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's the job. So there has to be a lot of humility there. But also don't stay in it for too long. Like it can be a really interesting way to enter politics, but it shouldn't be the destination. I would advise any young speechwriter to do it for a few years and then get out and do something else in comms, because you do get kind of thought of as that person, right? So,
right. Yeah. And the one piece of advice I would give people is expect edits. Because you never want to be precious about the writing because it's not going to stay the way you wrote it. Oh,
and that's a good thing because like it gets better. Like that's the beauty of it is you get it back from the editing process and you go, oh crap, I wish I'd said it that way in the first place. That's really good. Right. So some of the things, like over the years, there have been lines that I'm really quite proud of. But a lot like Ted Sorensen, I don't remember where they started. Like I don't know if a junior writer gave them to me and I kind of made them my own, and then the premier or prime minister made them their own. I don't know. I don't know. I don't remember. It's kind of not important. It's like what you all do together, right?
Well, I think that's a good summary of the writing process in politics. Much like everything else in politics, it is a team effort.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian communications company specializing in content creation, narrative development, and strategic communications. Our music was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.